My mom is a real worrier. Part of that, I think, is she watches court TV. Have you ever watched court TV? It's really, really ominous, and they've got this guy with a very ominous voice telling these stories. George Michael went to bed that night like every other night, but this wasn't every other night. And, it goes on to tell a story about George Michael's estranged college roommate just getting out of prison. And anyway, I think it's like 24/7. And I'm sure that feeds her worry and anxiety because she's watching it play out in these unusual but true life situations. And then, those things become reality. I've got just a touch of mom's worrying gene, not too much. I was reflecting on times that I've been afraid over the years. First one that came to mind actually was the birth of our firstborn. I think the birthing process always has some anxiety when it occurs for the first time, even for dads. And in the delivery room, during contractions, the heart rate of our firstborn was just spiking. And I intuited, at least from the residents there, that they were concerned, like I was picking up on some sort of anxious vibe. And I just got super scared. Of course, everything turned out fine, but there was that period that I was really afraid that something terrible was going to happen. And, I get the privilege of traveling quite a bit, and I'm sometimes in really, really unfamiliar places, in locations where I feel vulnerable because I don't know the language. And if I'm walking at night and don't know how to read the signals of a street or of a situation, I'm often imagining the worst. And those are times where I play into anxiety and fear. At night, those are terrible times when you can't sleep. And the way your mind gravitates to play out worst case scenarios, I don't know what that gravitational pull is to just imagine the worst when you can't get to sleep. Those are times where I'm racked with fear. Probably the scaredest I have ever been was on a flight over the Pacific Ocean at night from Hong Kong to San Francisco. And I told this story at a story slam that Doug Alexander put together for our church a while ago. But midway over the Pacific, the plane began to drop drastically, like as in people who were not in seat belts were floating in the air, were moving up. People's stuff on their trays flew up as we dropped so rapidly that you were in free fall. And, we finally caught ourselves, if that's even a phrase I can use in this case. And the pilot is screaming to the flight attendants, get in your seats and buckle up. And, I had a panic attack, like this acute sense that I was not in control. Of course, I was in like the middle row or middle set of seats in the middle seat. And so you're nowhere near a place where you can look out and try to get your bearings. And even if you were, it was at night and you're over the Pacific Ocean. That sense of absolute vulnerability, of not being in control, and that you're at the mercy of other forces. Those are the times when anxiety and fear seem to dominate my thinking and seem to shape how I react, and especially my heart rate or my sense of visceral danger. Those things are really, really powerful forces. And if there was ever a time that we feel out of control, there's some things happening this year that just seem to accentuate that. I'm sure every period of time feels like, oh, these are the worst times that we've ever had in these areas. And so it's probably not unique, certainly not to the human experience over millennia. But for many of us in our lifetimes, there's never been a more politically divisive period. I imagine that around pre-Civil War times, that sense of us and them within the country, with people that you're related to, North, South, Republican, Democrat, like that kind of intensity of political divisiveness may have existed in the form it does today in the pre-Civil War times. So it's a pretty intense, certainly within my lifetime. It's never been this terrible. And the racial divisions. I can imagine, though I was really a baby during segregation, that those kinds of racial divisions existed back then. And in my living memory, I've never felt and seen the kind of animosity that we're seeing with regard to racial division. It's amped up. And of course, the global pandemic, we've had global pandemics in my lifetime, multiple ones, nothing like this. Nothing that is so unmatchable to any of the previous pandemics in terms of the rate of infection, how easily this thing travels, and then the fact that it's probably about 10 times more deadly than the normal flu. And then you've got, like, right before 2020, at the end of 2019, there was these bushfires in Australia just ravaging large sections of Australia. The Amazon, their fires started to blow up, and now, of course, the west coast of the U.S. is under tremendous strain after 20 years of a mega drought. The west coast is burning up. Siberia hit 100 degrees for the first time in recorded history this year. Death Valley, 130 degrees. And scientists are saying this is the hottest the Earth has been in the years that we've been recording it, which is for quite some time, I think probably 100 years. So there's these climate events. I mean, right now, Hurricane Delta is sweeping through Louisiana and Texas, and we've seen these really destructive climate forces, these events that suggest that the Earth is convulsing. Like, these are scary times. And that sense of not having much control, being at the mercy of these forces. There are ways, I think, that we, in each of these cases, that we contribute to or diminish. I mean, thus the Mass, that we're trying to diminish the force here. So we do have a little bit of agency, but for the most part, we feel we are in a season of out-of-control climate change, out-of-control political divisiveness, out-of-control racial hatred, and an out-of-control virus. No wonder that we're experiencing the kind of anxiety that we are. How is it that we put our hearts and minds in a state of peace while in these times? That's been the emphasis of this recent series. We're going to continue on to the end of November with this. But for this one, I want to look at Psalm 27 as a set of remedies to putting your heart at rest while living in a time where there are many things happening that feel out of your control, and probably many things that are out of your control. How is it? What are the remedies? What are the steps we can take to have a heart of peace? So I'm going to have Psalm 27 read. I'm going to have it read in a non-American accent. I think hearing Scripture read in a different accent helps you to engage it differently. And I love that this particular reading is from an African that's likely from the continent of Africa. So if ever there was a continent that has experienced so much hardship, it's that continent. And so hearing this psalm read in an African accent, being read in English, is a way that I think is going to help us engage the words of Psalm 27.
The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter. In the day of trouble, he will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help. Cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord.
So the first part of this psalm deals with this comparison. God is described as light, as salvation, as a stronghold in the midst of evildoers and foes and armies besieging the psalmist and wars rising up against him. Yet the psalmist says, my heart doesn't fear that, and I have this confidence. What I find interesting about the psalmist, talking about this comparison, God's a stronghold. It's easy to believe God's a stronghold when everything's going well. Like, that takes no supernatural energy to believe that God is a fortress and a stronghold when you feel like there's nothing assailing you. But the psalmist says, when these things happen, when evildoers assail, his heart does not fear. Anxiety is a measure of our conviction, what we believe. And probably I'm not believing very deeply if my anxiety is some kind of litmus test and conviction that God is going to respond to this. God sees, as Emily taught. God's going to respond somehow with a redemptive beauty, with extraordinary grace, with immense power. I really believe that. And my lack of anxiety is a test, is a show of that conviction. I have to say for myself that those convictions don't run very deeply in times of trouble. And part of that is just a conviction that the character of God is such that it's going to be all right. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. Daniel 3 is this story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they're about to be cast into the fiery furnace. And they tell the leaders of that situation, our God will deliver us. But if he doesn't, we're still not going to do it. There's some sort of acknowledgement that we don't know the outcome. And the existence of hardship and adversity is not really the test of our faith. That is, if we're really faithful, none of these things will happen. We will live a life that is always positive, encouraging, and safe for the family. Like, I don't think that's what the psalmist is trying to suggest, that adversity will never happen. And there's a way in which making peace with that reality, that there's a certain mystery to adversity. The question of suffering has been debated for millennia. And coming to terms with the reality that we may experience and likely will experience some form of adversity is part of dealing with anxiety. I'm not talking about resignation. I'm talking about a conviction that God's more interested in my character than my comfort. And my character is fashioned not generally in times of comfort, but in times of adversity. And that may be allowed in my life from time to time. And yet I will see a redemptive outcome, likely in my character. So when adversity happens, there is still that confidence, even without trying to presuppose some kind of outcome where everything turns out rosy. So a conviction that God sees, that God is going to act, but not in a way that I may be able to predict, is part of the remedy one of this psalmist. Remedy two, I've got tinnitus. Just listen. Be quiet for a second. If you're in your home, stop talking. There, do you hear it? That ringing in the background? I do. And when I bring my mind to that tinnitus, then I can hear it. I can even hear it now. Like even when we're not quiet, I hear that ringing. God's presence is like a holy tinnitus. This ringing in the background, this ever-present reality that when we slow down and focus, then we come into a sense of being present to God's reality, God's presence. And so the psalmist is saying, I'd really love to dwell in your house. I just want to be in that space with you all the time. The beauty of the Holy Spirit is that now God lives in our house, in our temple, that there is an ever real presence of God in ourselves. And the psalmist is like, I just want to gaze upon or behold your beauty all the days of my life. Like, I just want to focus on your beauty. He uses the word inquire in your temple. The other way to translate that is to meditate in your temple. So this idea of becoming present to God's presence, to gaze upon, to behold, to hold in your mind for a moment as a meditation, God's beauty. All of us probably appreciate the beauty of God in different facets. For me, it's meditating on God's love, loving kindness, compassion. The ancient Near East, in which the Hebrews were bringing into clarity this God who was with them, looks so different than the other ancient Near Eastern deities who were often capricious and warlike or unconcerned with humans. To have a monotheistic faith rise out of that space, that the chief characteristic is loving kindness. Over and over the Old Testament says, the Lord, compassionate and gracious, filled with loving kindness. That picture, that's the beauty of the Lord that I focus on. And usually I'll do a breath prayer at night when I'm playing out worst case scenarios. I'll breathe in slowly. The Lord is my shepherd. I'll breathe out. I shall lack nothing. You do that a couple hundred times, and that's what it is like to come into a sense of God's presence. Or sometimes, if I can still myself, I'll imagine myself on on the bank of a river on a glorious day like the last couple days have been, and I'm just leaning back to back against Jesus, who's leaning back against me, and neither of us are speaking. Jesus doesn't want to hear my requests at this time, nor does he have anything particular he wants to say to me. He just wants to feel my back or my shoulder pressed up against him and just be quiet in one another's presence. That kind of meditation, I believe, is what this psalmist is suggesting, and why this psalmist can say, I'm not going to fear when these things happen. I'm going to be confident, because I believe this desire to gaze on the beauty of the Lord, to meditate or inquire in his temple, is part of what brings confidence in times of adversity. So, making some peace with the reality of adversity, and then recognizing that God's presence is better than deliverance. And I know that's hard to fathom, but coming to that conclusion that I would rather have the presence of God in difficulty than be delivered out of this difficulty and not have God's presence. So coming to that conclusion through meditating. And then he talks about making melody, the power of making melody. There is something about music that changes our perspective, that can shift anxiety into a state of peace. The Psalms are great places. I mean, we've got lots and lots of melody making in these songs. And I've connected a few times with Father Gregory, who's the Orthodox priest of St. Cyril and Methodius Orthodox Church, just down the road from us here. And you know, I think I mentioned in my last sermon that their liturgy is all sung. And he loves that when we engage in prayer as a way of making music, like it's all musical. All liturgy in the Orthodox Church is musical. All prayers are musical. And for him, the off-road extemporaneous praying of Protestants just feels a little noisy to him. Like, here are some songs in liturgy and in the Psalms that are like highways that have been tested over time as really clear places where you engage God in song. And so his recommendation is, if you're going to make melody, enjoy the melodies that have been made for us. We will have a chance to make some melody at the end as part of our meditation, but I appreciate that invitation to, when you don't have words, that's okay. It's actually preferable in his Orthodox tradition that we don't have words, but that we lean on the words that have been written. As an aside, I was talking about the issue of anxiety and remedies from within the Orthodox Church. And he said, in the monastic tradition in the Orthodox Church, in addition to, chastity, poverty, and obedience, manual labor is like a sacred thing that they believe is part of our spirituality. And he says, with manual labor, you have some sense of both the agency you do have to create an outcome that has some kind of good, but also your limitations. And I just thought that's a bonus remedy. I'm not going to include that in my 5. That's an extra credit one. Manual labor as a way of dealing with anxiety. Work in the garden, maybe sing while you do it. Then he's got this interesting exchange the psalmist does. God tells me, seek my face. And my heart says, I want to seek it. So don't hide your face. My parents have abandoned me, he confesses. I don't want you to hide your face from me. There are times where God does feel hidden. In fact, in the Jesuit tradition, there's this daily examen, and every day you rehearse or review times that God felt absence, and they call it desolation, and times where God felt particularly present consolation. Every day you acknowledge, there was desolation today where I did not see your face, where your face felt hidden from me. And the thing about hiding is when you're hidden, when someone is hidden, they are not unpresent. They're there, maybe in the same room, just out of your line of sight. There may be a sense of feeling far from God because you have wandered. And the feeling of God's absence might be a good time to reflect, Lord, search me, search my heart. Is there a wandering way in me? Or it may simply be an invitation, as it appears here. I want you to expend some energy looking for me. I want you to chase me. I want you to hunt me down, is what God's saying. Don't chase after other things to salve the anxiety that you're feeling, or even chase after deliverance. Chase after me. And what that forces us to do when we decide, I don't see God, but I'm going to press in rather than press away, is it forces us to say, I want God more than I want out of this situation. Even though it's really hard, and even though the easiest thing feels like to abandon faith or to wander away from God or to seek other things, I'm going to chase after God more than any of the other remedies that I'm looking at. I want God more than I want deliverance, and I want God more than I want out of this situation. Adversity offers this opportunity to intimacy in ways that when everything is going well, you don't have that same opportunity. Intimacy grows in adversity. It's great soil for intimacy, closeness with God. Hardship is a sort of gift in that, we see in the desert is this metaphor that shows up again and again in Scripture. And the desert is the honeymoon place for God to be close to God's people. And it's in times where God's people have aligned themselves with empire or have aligned themselves with comfort that they lose sight of God. And it's in the desert where, we've got the desert fathers post New Testament, where people got really, really intimate with God in places of desolation. And so this invitation to press in, to seek God's face in the midst of accusation and the things that are listed in this psalm as hardships, like those become invitations. And the psalm ends with the remedy of cultivating hope through waiting. I believe I am going to look on the goodness of the Lord in this life, in the land of the living, not in the afterlife. In this life, I'm going to see God's goodness. Now, it may not be shaped exactly in the way that I'm imagining God's goodness would be, to get me out of this financial bind, to heal the wounds of our land, to, bring an end to the catastrophic climate change that's happening. God may have a different way in which God's goodness shows up, but even if you took a moment to think about those places in your life where there wasn't a clear resolution, like you did live through, all of you've lived through different adversities, hardships. Not all of them have resulted in complete resolution or deliverance. I'll bet in many of them you can identify gifts, ways in which you grew, redemptive outcomes of those situations. It's time to recognize that may happen in the current anxieties. You will look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, Maybe not in the form that you are hoping or would imagine it, but there is that expectancy, a holy expectancy, that God's goodness is going to manifest itself because that's God's nature. That kind of, I'm just going to be patient here. I'm going to bear up. The last chapter hasn't yet been written. I'm going to wait because I'm going to see that in some way, shape, or form. That's the challenge at the end, to be strong. Let your heart take courage because you're waiting for something that you fully expect, the goodness of God, in a way that you may not completely be able to imagine, but it will occur. That's the fifth remedy. So we're not immune from adversity. Make peace with that reality. That's okay. God's presence is better than deliverance. We choose to sing even in the midst of difficulty and make melody. And we will press into God, not press away. We're going to chase God more than we're going to chase comfort. And then we choose to wait expectantly for redemptive outcome. There's a parable in a number of native traditions. I've seen this one associated with the Cherokee tribe. And I'm going to, hopefully with some integrity to the story, adapt it to what I've been talking about. There was a Cherokee grandfather talking to his granddaughter. And he was telling her, there are two wolves inside me, and they're locked in fierce battle. One of the wolves is anxiety, and one of the wolves is confidence that God's going to be good. And there are two wolves inside you too, and they're having that fight. And the granddaughter asked, well, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. There are ways in which we feed the wolf of anxiety. I know I do. I know court TV does. Sometimes the news does as well, honestly. How do you feed that wolf of a conviction about God's goodness, God's mercy, God's beauty, God's kindness? I think these 5 remedies are ways to press in to feeding the wolf of confidence that you will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living.